Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. My guest on the Godcast this week is Dion Forster. Dion is an academic. He's a professor of public theology and he's based in Amsterdam in Holland. I do hope you enjoy this Godcast. If you do, then do check out others. There are literally hundreds of podcasts and Godcasts to choose from. Lots of people from the world of church, Christianity, but also celebrities, sports people, musicians, authors, you name it. There's something there for everybody. For now, do please enjoy this interview with Professor Dion Forster. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Professor Dion Forster. Dion is a professor working in Amsterdam in the Netherlands and is a professor of public theology amongst many other things. Dion, it's wonderful to welcome you to the Godcast. How are you?
Alex, doing great. Thank you. It's a dreary day in Amsterdam today. I was back home in Cape Town last week and the weather was much better, but Amsterdam has its charms.
It's a city I've never been to. It's a place I'd love to come and we'll get there eventually. Dion, before we start, offline we mentioned that you were dressed in black and you've got this badge that maybe people can't quite see if they're watching, but just tell us about this badge and the purpose of wearing black today.
Yeah, so Alex, for some years now, I've been part of the World Council of Churches campaign Thursdays in Black. And for the last couple of years, we've been inviting friends and colleagues and students and churches around the world to wear black. And if you have one of the badges, it often generates a bit of conversation. The campaign itself is to raise awareness around gender-based violence. We also happen to be, as you can hear from my accent, I'm from South Africa, just into what's called the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So today is a Thursday as we're recording, so I'm wearing black. And it often just, facilitates an opportunity to speak to people around the importance of us addressing patriarchy, particularly partner violence and violence against women and girls.
Yeah, that sounds like a fabulous thing to be part of. Is there a link people can find, Dion? Is it just go online and they'll find more
Yeah,
information?
so the easiest thing to do is just to look for the hashtag Thursdays in Black on most social media platforms, or just to search for Thursdays in Black World Council of Churches, and it'll pop straight up.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And just for people who aren't familiar with you, Dion, and just tell us a little bit about your story. How does somebody from South Africa end up in Amsterdam of all places, and maybe a little bit about your kind of career today?
Yes, yes. Well, how does someone end up in Amsterdam? It's a great place to end up, by the way. It is a really lovely city. So yeah, I'm, as you mentioned, professor of public theology at the Vrije University of Amsterdam, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And I've been here actually just for a year now. I arrived from South Africa. I was previously professor of public theology and ethics at Stellenbosch University in Cape Town. But originally, I'm born in Zimbabwe and grew up in South Africa in the 70s and 80s. And my interests have always been particularly in issues of social justice. So I was quite involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. I'm a Methodist minister, ordained Methodist minister, and this is a predominantly Black South African church, and I spent my ministry predominantly serving in what are called township churches, Black churches, and they really began to think about the ways in which Christianity and the church can play an incredibly important role in working for justice, in advocating for those who are experiencing injustice, and that eventually, developed into an academic interest. I completed a first PhD in 2006, and then later a second PhD. The first one was in systematic theology, and the second one was in New Testament studies. But both of them sort of at the intersection of social identity complexity, so particularly issues of gender, of race, the ways in which we think of ourselves and others, and how religion and particularly Christianity can sometimes play an ambivalent role in that. Sometimes it's positive, and sometimes it can be negative or challenging.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I think you've covered a little bit of it there. I was going to ask you to break down, public theology. What does that actually mean? But you've touched on that, haven't you, with matters of identity and social injustice. What's the what are some of the key differences that you've picked up from being in South Africa and moving to Amsterdam? Dion, yesterday I was at a retreat house in the Yorkshire Dales, and there was a lady there from South Africa doing a year's kind of ministry, and she just said it's so different, the food, but apart from the kind of the obvious things like the food, what about the culture? Is it what things are noticeably different for you?
Yeah, I mean, so what I would say, Alex, one of the major differences for me has been, and certainly in the kind of work that I do, is that Western Europe really is much more secularized. So the sort of overt role of religion in public life differs significantly from sub-Saharan Africa to sort of Western European democracies. And now you'll hear that I'm choosing my words fairly carefully. I think Europe is undergoing some changes in this regard, and some of it has to do with migration. The fact that there are persons from Africa and Asia and the Arab world, from highly religious contexts, moving into Western Europe, is changing the ways in which people perform their faith publicly. But we're also seeing, one of the interesting things here, which is not that different from what we encountered in South Africa, is we're seeing a sort of entanglement of religion and politics. So in South Africa, for example, we had, both religious Christian support for apartheid, certainly in the Dutch Reformed Church, but also, Black liberation theologies and the sort of liberation movement, the anti-apartheid movement, which was also led by people like Desmond Tutu and others from the Christian churches. What's interesting here in Europe is that we're also seeing an entanglement of religion and politics. Here it often tends to sort of circle around some of the political issues that relate to identity and culture. So, a lot of the work that I do here is around the ways in which, even though the Netherlands is supposedly a highly secular society, there's this overt anti-Islamic sort of tendency in the politics. Now, that is a sort of occident of a time when, these politicians like Geert Wilders and others thought of, what it means to be Dutch as being white and Protestant and Christian, And so even though they may no longer be religious in that sense, the occidents of this religiosity still continue to exist in public life. So part of my role in my work is to try and think, cautiously about some of these issues. How do we disentangle perhaps problematic ways of thinking about faith with political ideologies?
It's fascinating listening to you make those remarks, Dion. We're in a very urban setting in Lancashire for anybody who's watching in northwest England, and we've gone from being a very traditional white middle class church congregation to an international congregation. We have people from all across the world of all different nationalities and colours and creeds, and in many ways, it's wonderful. It's fabulous to see this diversity in the church, but it's not without its problems. We had a family who'd moved from Africa, and my colleague is a priest in a same-sex relationship. Uh, that has raised issues. That has raised issues for the family and their longevity in the church, and hopefully we've resolved some of those issues. But these are the kind of things that happen, aren't they, when you bring an international community together? And the challenges can be quite profound can be quite challenging for the church leadership as well, would you say?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I often, particularly when I'm teaching on issues related to faith and public life, I try to sort of help people to understand that theological convictions and the ways in which we make sense of our faith exist in at least three spaces. Of course, these are constructions, they exist everywhere simultaneously, but the sort of three spaces in which our theology operates is the most common one that all of us know, which is the theology of the church or the faith community. And that has a particular sort of texture to it. As an ordained person who's preaching, what I'm trying to do there is to build faith, to facilitate for people a deepening of their spiritual lives. So I'm quoting from the scriptures, I'm relying on experience. But, theology also exists in a different space. So in the academy, often we're a little more scientific, if we can say so, or critical, objective. We often evaluate beliefs in a sort of neutral way to say, well, why is it that one group of Christians believes this while another group of Christians believes that? What leads to the holding of those beliefs? So the academic world can sometimes be in conflict even or in tension with what's happening in the churches, critical. But then, of course, faith exists in a third space as well. So we have the public of the church, the public of the academy, but we have the public of society at large. And what I think, we sometimes don't take enough of an account of is the fact that, there are these kinds of beliefs. Some of them are religious beliefs and some of them are secular beliefs. Charles Taylor, the philosopher, speaks of these as the sort of modern social imaginaries, the ways in which we imagine the world works. Now, heteronormativity, for example, which you mentioned with the family who moved into your community, some people would say, well, that's a theological conviction. The Bible says. But very often when we do a little bit of research into that, we find actually, no, these sort of heteronormative beliefs are far more culturally informed than they are biblically or spiritually informed. So part of what we have to do is to be able to understand, well, what role, for example, does our imagination, the way in which we imagine that society functions, a father and a mother with children, the family unit, the sort of African setting, how does that shape the ways in which people make sense of their faith? And what comes first, the reading of the text or the identity that informs how the text is received? So that's part of the sort of complexity that I think we need to wrestle with. Of course, at the end of the day, I would say, Alex, for people like yourself and myself, and I'm sure for many of your viewers, what we're wanting to do is to take our faith very seriously. We're wanting to really relate to this God who we love and who loves us in a way that is responsible, but also to understand what is the content of that belief. Alex, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, I was so interested. I didn't want any background noise to disturb what you were saying. Sorry, listeners, but yeah, we have a thing at our church, Dion. I call it the three B's: belonging, behaving, and believing. And I'm working in a very working class urban setting. We have a lot of people who I would probably suggest would quite happily sign up for the belonging bit. They feel they're attracted to the community groups that we do. It gets a little bit more challenging, doesn't it, when you want them to then become believers and behavers in a certain way. I suppose what I'm saying there is sometimes their behaviors don't match their belonging. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what's interesting is, as I mentioned in a previous life, I was professor of ethics and public theology. So, a lot of my training has been in theological ethics, and particularly because I'm a Methodist, I'm a Wesleyan, so sort of a lapsed Anglican, we can say. Um, we tend to hold this view that faith and action, or theology and ethics, are not separate from one another, that what we confess with our mouths needs to be matched by what we do with our lives. And this, I think, was one of the big problems that we faced, certainly during apartheid South Africa. I think it's one of the challenges that we're seeing in settings like in the Netherlands, where Christians are often behaving inappropriately in public settings. We're seeing it in America, the sort of evangelical turn towards a kind of populist nationalism. So there's the sort of mismatch between what we believe and what we do. And I think the church plays an absolutely crucial role in forming people into the habits of what it means to be Christian, what it means to bear the name of the one who is the Christ, the one who invited people from the margins into the center, the one who questioned the sort of power relations, who is it that can cast the stone? The one who sort of invited people to think differently about, things such as disease, what is clean and unclean. So part of what I think is important in the church is, and that's why for me it's so encouraging to hear about the diversity in your congregation. It teaches us to live with the people that God loves. When we get to heaven one day, heaven's not going to look that much like most of the churches that most of us belong to. It's going to be far more diverse. And part of what we're trying to do in that space is to habituate ourselves into the kind of loving ethics, the virtue of what it means to live with the people who Christ welcomes. I remember some years ago, it's probably more than 20 years ago now, I was heading up the sort of human sexuality task team in our denomination in South Africa, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. We were really trying to make sense of, as a church, how do we relate to persons who love Jesus, particularly who want to be blessed in their relationships before Christ, who want to serve in the church, but don't fit into the sort of traditional marriage categories. How do we deal with that? And part of what we were doing in that work was really to say, how does the presence of these people who Christ invites to the Eucharistic table change the ways in which we live with one another? And I remember one of the folks saying to us, you don't get to decide who comes to the table. Jesus decides that. The only thing that you have the right to decide on is, how will I live responsibly, lovingly, with the people that Jesus invites? So you're not the host at that table, you're the guest. And how do we live responsibly with one another? So I think sometimes, that mismatch between what we believe and what we do is a painful space to live in. Maybe just one little quote. Stanley Hauerwas, who was one of my professors, he used to say, often when we recognize the difference between what we believe and how we live, we try to change what we believe rather than how we live. And that's always been a bit of a challenge for me.
Yeah. Again, you got my brain going, which takes some doing, Dion. So congratulations on that. You say we don't decide who's welcome at the table, but do you think sometimes we decide who presides at the table? I'm a member of the General Synod in the Church of England, and I've just had some good news that a private members motion that I've raised to have a national strategy for vocations from people from a working class setting is going to be debated. I think there's a couple of questions here. One is, for me, I think there's a rich harvest of people in this demographic in our country, but also how's that different maybe in somewhere like South Africa? Is it a different ideal there? Are we finding people from urban areas and the suburbs actually being ordained?
Yeah, so this is, this is a very, very interesting question. So firstly, just to say well done. I wrote a little book and a couple of years ago on faith and work called Transform Your Work Life, which I co-authored with a Christian working person. I've done quite a bit of research, again, as part of the sort of public theology focus on, if you are not. So let's just differentiate two things. If you are not called to the priesthood, if you're not called to be a pastor, a priest, does that mean that you have no ministry? Of course, the logical answer is absolutely not. I mean, every single person who is loved by Christ is invited by Christ to be part of God's work, the Missio Dei, in the world. And for some people, that means discipling their workplace. It means evangelizing, not only the people, but the structures around them so that they represent the good news. It's a very political act to be involved in. So I've often, worked with people who are homemakers, teachers, healthcare workers, union organizers. All of those can be godly activities, to establish the virtues and the values, the just, inclusive, flourishing values of the kingdom of God in these spaces. Of course, there are some people, Alex, like you and I, who are called to a particular kind of ministry, the ministry of shepherding those who gather for worship, who need to be formed in the life of the church. And I think we need to open those gates a lot wider. I can see certainly in some settings, classism becomes a sort of barrier. From which sector of society do you come? Are you academically capable enough or recognized enough to be ordained? In other settings, again, it has to do with, the sort of freedom to be able to move. So one of the things that we saw developing in the church in South Africa, and that, yes, again, it's one of the reasons why I'm grateful to be a Methodist, was that the majority of our churches were actually led by lay people. So lay preachers who would run these congregations. And they did the most amazing work, because when they preached on a Sunday, they know what it feels like to have a job that you don't love. You're doing this because you're needing to earn a salary to put your kids through school and afford healthcare and feed them. But that doesn't mean that God is absent. So their sermons were often a lot richer. Their sort of pastoral counseling and care was often a lot more connected to people. So, I have a sense that, we do a disservice to the church when we don't recognize these sort of three forms of ministry that we have in most churches. I know it's the same in the Church of England, certainly in most Protestant churches. We have, the apostolate of the priesthood, so those who are called to priestly ministries. We have the diaconate, those who are called to word and service, which I think is probably one of the most important ministries. And then the apostolate of the laity, persons whose calling is to a lay vocation, called to be a doctor, called to be a lawyer, called to be a teacher. That's where I often think God changes the world. I think you're muted again.
Do you know, I've never put mute on, but because I'm so interested in listening to, I mute myself anyway. People are used to me on the Godcast.
But Alex, isn't it true that since 2020, that's the way in which we speak to one another now? Can you hear me? You are muted.
Yeah, yeah, but it's also great that we can do this as well. That we can have these conversations. Deanna, I was going to say, while I was muted, was talk about changing the world. You come from South Africa, and you mentioned Desmond Tutu a little earlier. What is his legacy, would you say, in the country that you spent much of your time in, if there is one? I don't think we hear about it in the West. We certainly don't hear about it in the UK. But if you could just share a bit of that, that would be great. I've got a barking dog in the background. Apologies, everybody.
Perfect. It's lovely to have a dog participating in the podcast. Alex, I would say, Archbishop Tutu, perhaps, in recent history is the kind of archetypical, faithful, courageous Christian person. I mean, he embodies in his life and his witness and his ministry so much of what I hope we will see with more persons. In terms of the kind of work that I do, we would often describe him as the archetypical kind of public theologian, someone who recognized that the consequences, political, economic, social, racial consequences of the gospel of Christ have an impact on public life. and that so much of what we believe about Jesus should impact the ways in which we engage with the social issues around us. So, Archbishop Tutu is certainly regarded, I think, as one of the most important contemporary historical figures in South Africa, possibly even internationally from a Christian perspective, because he just had a way that was sort of steeped in both a deep spirituality, a wonderful sort of almost naive love for Jesus that had this incredible political power. I remember as a young person in my late teens, early 20s, attending anti-apartheid marches where Archbishop Tutu spoke. And he always had this sort of capacity to remind us that even if the powers of the state, the political powers, the people who tried to enact their will through violence were all around us, that there was a power that was even stronger than that. And that was the power of the love of Christ, the transforming power of God's work through ordinary people. I have a little bag in my office here, which has the quote from Desmond Tutu that says, "Do your little bits of good wherever you are, because when they are put together, they will overwhelm the world in love." And so I saw in his life that kind of ministry. The ordinary things are often the things that are far more powerful than the extraordinary.
It's a wonderful tribute to him. He's I don't have many theological heroes. I don't think it's good to have heroes, but he is somebody that I find extraordinary and incredible, and for you to say that. And what about your own context, Dion? In Amsterdam, which, like I say, I've not been, but on the face of it, looks like one of the most liberal cities in the world. How do you see the role of Christianity there? What kind of things are you saying to your students about, who are living and working in a city such with such delights as Amsterdam?
Yes, the other day I was walking through the old city, which of course is, that's the whole area around, the Grote Kerk, the big church. The red light district is right there. Of course, it's well known that certain drugs are legalized in the city. And I was walking around that area, and someone had sprayed some graffiti on a piece of wood, which was, covering some renovations. And it said, Amsterdam is so low, it had to be damned to be saved. Now, of course, there's this play on, being below sea level and the dams that protect it, but of course, also this sort of moral judgment. My sense is that that there is a very important role for people of sincere faith in places like this. Very often what we encounter here is that people want to escape to these kinds of places because they find themselves misrecognized, perhaps even oppressed by the ideas and ideals of others on them. So people whose sexuality doesn't fit the norm, people whose sense of style or dress doesn't quite fit in with others. They need to break free, and they often find space in these places. But one of the challenges is often that, associated with those freedoms, there are some vices, so drug and alcohol abuse, human trafficking, sex work, these kinds of exploitations. And this is often where the church is involved. For those of your viewers who don't know, just outside of the Grote Kerk, on the road, on the floor, there's an artwork which was commissioned by sex workers and placed into the road. And it's a brass casting of a woman's breast in the road outside of the church. And it was commissioned as a sort of act of thanks, a reminder from the sex workers that they always had this place of safety in the church, that this was a place where they could go, where they wouldn't be judged, where people wouldn't think of them as morally deviant, where they would be held within the reality of their lives. That these were young women and girls, sometimes young men, boys, who had entered into this kind of work because perhaps there weren't viable alternatives. Perhaps they'd had the kind of life which didn't give them the kind of opportunities that people like you and I have for employment and security that happens elsewhere. And here is this space that says to them, it's okay. This is a place where you are loved. This is a place where you belong, where the kind of simplistic moral judgments that may be cast upon you, those categories don't operate here. So, also, of course, we had this in Cape Town, in the inner city at the Central Methodist Church in Cape Town. Alex, I'm going to use a swear word here, so if there are any viewers who are offended, please, mute for just a moment. But they had what they called a shit theology. Now, in the inner city of Cape Town, one of the problems was that homeless people didn't have bathrooms to use. And I mean, can you imagine anything as dehumanizing as having to relieve yourself in the streets and facing arrest for doing so? So what they did, this church said, well, it's unlikely we're going to get all of these people to come in for a sermon on Sunday, but let's open our bathrooms. Let's make sure that these bathrooms are well maintained, that they're clean, so that if a homeless person needs to perform one of the most basic things that any person has to do, this is a space where they will know, because of the gospel of Christ, because of people who will actually do something which is ministry, clean a toilet, they can come here and find that relief, that space. So one of the things that we are seeing with the churches in spaces like these is a reimagining of what ministry looks like, a reimagining of what our theology, our faith requires of us, when it's not just about preaching a sermon on Sunday or having a Bible study group, but of thinking about, how do we meet people where they are? How does the gospel of Christ encounter people at the point of their greatest need?
Yeah, and it's so important. We are, we're not Cape Town and we're not Amsterdam, but we're Burnley in Lancashire, and we have, we serve two of the most deprived states in the country, and it's tough, but you just have to find ways to meet people where they are. And I love your example of a simple piece of sanitation, just humanizing somebody who probably feels very dehumanized as well. And what
Yeah.
about, and Dion, what about the Church of England? We are in the UK, we've been in the news for all the wrong reasons in recent weeks, for the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the safeguarding difficulties that we've been going through. Does I wonder if the shockwave felt in the UK reaches beyond the UK? Is it important how credible our Archbishop of Canterbury is across the globe and in the wider Anglican communion?
Yeah, so I mean, let me start by saying safeguarding, I think, is an absolutely crucial aspect of ministry. And of course, it's entered into the ways in which we think about how we do our ministry in a very particular way, because of the unfortunate history of abuses that have taken place in churches throughout the world. So the first thing that I would say is that I think churches have to be much more responsible and attentive to the cries of those who don't feel safe in certain spaces in the church, and that's a reality. We have to reflect on that and think about how we represent the loving, welcoming, safe presence of Christ to persons in our communities. I think the second thing that I want to say is that, of course, whenever these events take place and they're publicized, it does harm the witness of the church. And in some senses, I actually think perhaps in a sort of paradoxical way, that's a good thing. It is good that we are exposed to the light and that the truth of our humanity and brokenness is shown to the world. I think the test is going to be how we respond to these realities. Do we respond with a kind of aloofness, defensiveness, to say that's not how we are as the church? Of course, there is no institution in the world that is not broken and sinful. Now, that's not an excuse for what happens. In fact, it's the opposite. It's to say we have to be more cautious, more responsible, more loving, more transparent. So my sense would be to say, there is an opportunity here, I think, for the church to be continually renewed and healed in both its public witness, but also in its polity, the way in which it structures its work and its mission in the world.
Dion, we said before we keep it to 30 minutes, and we've gone a little bit over it. I mean, it's so fascinating, and I hope you feel we've done a bit of public theology there in half an hour, and I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you. Just when you're not doing academia and teaching and worshiping, what other interests do you have? What have you found great joys in Amsterdam?
Yeah, well, the one thing is I've been a lifelong cyclist, and of course, this is the cycling capital of the world. So I do love to ride. I have a little British, actually, Brompton folding bike, which I love. I love riding. I'm an avid runner. In fact, last week Saturday, before I flew home from Cape Town back to Amsterdam, I ran the Winelands half marathon, which was great. Couldn't walk for 2 days. So I enjoy those things. And yeah, love spending time with my family. We have an adult daughter in Cape Town who's 25, and our son Liam, who's with us here in Amsterdam. So, we have the privilege of living in these two spaces between Cape Town and Amsterdam. It's a very privileged life that we have.
Fabulous. And Dean, if people want to find a little bit more about yourself, where can we find you? Just signpost us to your
Yeah,
website,
so
whatever. Yeah.
probably the easiest is to go to my website, dionfoster.com. And I also have a YouTube channel. If you just search for Dion Foster, mainly theological reflections on there. And yeah, but probably the website is the one place where everything ends up.
Fabulous. Okay, Dion. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed being a guest. And if you've enjoyed this, then do check out the Godcast. There's hundreds of interviews there with theologians, musicians, sports people, authors, you name it. There's something there for everybody. But for now, Dion, thanks for coming on. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Bless you well. Bye then.